It's the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back to the 2018 Locked On Podcast Network NBA Mock Draft. I'm David Locke, your host, commissioner of the Mock Draft. Today we have picks 13 through 18, and at 2 o'clock today Eastern Time, a Reddit AMA at NBA Reddit. The LA Clippers are the first on the clock at 13, at least for now. Denver 14, Washington 15, Phoenix 16, Milwaukee 17, and then San Antonio at 18. If you're just joining us, we'll head into the NBA Draft headquarters / war room of each and every one of these teams with the Locked On Podcast Network hosts, the local experts on the biggest stories, the local daily podcast hosts on the Locked On Podcast Network. Sports Illustrated's Jeremy Woo has done fabulous work for us, breaking down every single player and giving his analysis. And we'll check in with Locked On NBA host Josh Lloyd, who you hear every Monday with the biggest local experts on the biggest stories, and Jake Madison of Locked On NBA, who hosts with John Corrales on Wednesdays. If you're just joining us, day one started this thing with not a ripple, but a tidal wave. Luka Doncic went number 1 to Phoenix in a major surprise. DeAndre Ayton went second to Sacramento. Jaren Jackson third to Atlanta. And then Memphis threw a curveball, going Trae Young, the scorer. Dallas held with Mo Bamba, and Orlando wrapped up mock draft number 1 with Wendell Carter. That left Marvin Bagley on the board to start day 2. Mikal Bridges went to Cleveland. The Knicks war room was something else, and they ended up with Michael Porter. Kevin Knox went to Philadelphia at 10, with Keith Pompey telling big stories about trade opportunities Philadelphia had with Kawhi Leonard. 11, Charlotte, Lonnie Walker, and we wrapped it up with Shai Gilgeous-Alexander going to the Clippers in 12. So we sit here now with the Clippers on the clock, but rumors and talk of a trade coming down, and we'll get the latest on that in a second. But let me remind you that for all the latest on the Locked On Podcast Network, go to LockedOnSports.com, and remember to subscribe to your local favorite NBA team's daily podcast on the Locked On Podcast Network. We are getting word now officially, Dallas has traded for the 13th pick of the draft. Dallas has acquired Danilo Gallinari as well as the 13th pick of the draft in exchange for Wesley Matthews. So Wesley Matthews has been traded to the LA Clippers in exchange for the 13th pick, and Dallas has taken on the contract of Danilo Gallinari as well as taking this 13th pick. Let's go to Dallas, Texas, and find out more in their NBA Draft headquarters. They're now on the clock for the 13th pick.
And I am back. Again, this is Nick Angstead with Mavs Moneyball. Isaac Harris normally joins me on the podcast, but he is away. He writes for Mavs.com. We are back. The Dallas Mavericks made a trade to get the number 13th pick from the Clippers and ended up selecting Miles Bridges, and we were very excited about it. We were sort of upset when Lonnie Walker went off the board to Charlotte, but when the Clippers picked Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, we were excited that Miles Bridges fell all the way to 13. I doubt that he's going to be available there in the actual draft, but this was super exciting for us. The trade that we ended up making was Wes Matthews for Danilo Gallinari and the number 13th pick. We figured that the Clippers wanted to get off some contracts, and Danilo Gallinari was a pretty big one. He's up for, I think, $22 million for the next 2 years, and Wes Matthews is a $19 million expiring contract this season because he's going to pick up that player option. So he picks that up. The Clippers now have a really, really good shooting guard that they can play next to Lou Williams. That's a pretty good fit right there. And then he's expiring, so he comes off the books. And then the Mavericks, for taking on that contract, get that pick. Super excited about it. Super excited for Miles Bridges. Other guys that were on the board at the time that we considered, if Miles Bridges would have been gone, we probably would have picked Zaire Smith. We also thought about Robert Williams, who was still on the board. Colin Sexton. We almost decided to take him like as just an asset that we would trade for somebody else and we'd offer or something like that, because he's dropping in this mock draft. We made a bunch of other trades. The player we really, really wanted in offering all these other trades, and I talked about in the first pick and the number 5 pick that the Mavericks made, we made probably 10 offers to teams for different trades. The player we really want was Mikal Bridges or Lonnie Walker, like I mentioned. And so after the West trade, we also offered the Knicks. We said, we'll give you this 13th pick for Courtney Lee in the 9th pick. We still had some extra cap space. We'll say we'll take on Courtney Lee's contract, take him off your hands, and we'll take the 9th pick for the 13th. For our, for taking on this cap space, we'll move up, and you guys only have to move back about 4 spots. The Knicks were not interested in cap space. They had no interest in any of that, which totally makes sense. They're not really into bringing any free agents in. I think if James Dolan would have been around, if James Dolan had his say, he would have done that trade, but it didn't happen. Other trades we offered Phoenix a cap dump of Brandon Knight for the 16th pick. So basically the Mavericks would take on Brandon Knight. This was before the Gallinari trade that we made. We offered that to Phoenix. They turned that down. We also did the trade that everybody is talking about for the Mavericks, which is for Denver taking on the contract of Kenneth Faried for the 14th pick. The Mavericks can just straight up do that. And so we also offered in that trade for Denver, we offered the Mavericks 33rd pick. But Denver didn't want to do that. Adam Mares decided not to go that route. So we didn't get that pick. And the last one that I really want to talk about is we offered Washington Dwight Powell for Jan Mahinmi and the 15th pick. And so we thought maybe flip-flopping Dwight Powell, who's an athletic big, which we know John Wall's come out and said he wants to play with an athletic big. So we'll take that. We'll take NBA champion Jan Mahinmi back and his crazy contract of like $15 million for the next 3 years or 2 years or something like that. And we'll get the 15th pick for our trouble. That was still on the board. We thought that there was a possibility if Washington said that, if they said yes to that trade, then the Mavericks could have had the 5th, the 13th, and then also the 15th pick as well. We thought that was a possibility, but ended up not happening. But we're happy. The Mavericks are very happy getting Mo Bamba and Miles Bridges to pair with Dennis Smith Jr. and Harrison Barnes. Figure that's a very good core moving forward. Very excited about it. So let's send it back to David Locke to talk about the number 14th pick. David.
Well, thanks a lot, Nick. And yes, Denver is now on the board with the 14th pick, but boy, were Nick and the Mavericks active. Lots of possibilities. I think Washington probably should have done that deal. I think Dwight Powell is better than Jan Mahinmi, though, and they get off the Mahinmi contract, though, they would give up this pick. Never quite sure what you're getting at this point of the draft as well. In fact, after the 11th pick of the draft, about half the players never become rotation players. The pick that we just had was 13, Miles Bridges. Jeremy Wu of Sports Illustrated has been our draft expert throughout the draft. He's done a fabulous job, and he's back with us for episode 3 of the NBA mock draft. And here's his breakdown of the 13th pick to the Dallas Mavericks, Miles Bridges out of Michigan State.
Mikal Bridges is a really talented guy who I think views you as an instant impact player who will be able to impact both ends of the floor. I think some of his, long-term, potential may have been oversold a little bit. I see him as more of a floor guy than a ceiling guy, given that he's already 21, he'll be 22 in August. And older guys in the lottery tend to not return lottery value. I think if history is an indicator. But he'll be able to hit open threes. Potentially he'll be able to switch a little bit. I don't view him as a top end lockdown defender, but I do think the versatility matters. And it's nice that you can sort of superimpose him onto a lot of different teams. Teams need wings who can do those things. So I think he's justifiable, in the back end of the top 10 if you have that need.
I may have watched the wrong game of his, but I thought I saw a lot of Wesley Johnson. Am I wrong?
I can see that comparison in terms of the shooting, the versatility, the body, the perimeter game. I think if you're drafting him that high, you're hoping that you get a better outcome than that. Maybe you're hoping you get a guy who can sort of play like maybe even like a Danny Green type role. But I think he needs to continue working on his ball handling. The offensive creation, I don't think will be his strong suit.
There's been a lot written about Bridges recently, including Cleaning the Glass did a really interesting piece about his lack of free-throw shooting. Michigan State has done a nice job producing NBA players. So Bridges, you would think, falls under that. And it's interesting that Jeremy talks about him possibly falling in the draft. Some people have him as a top 10 talent. He averaged 17 points, 7 rebounds, 3 assists last year, hit 36% of his threes while taking a high volume, 85% of his free throws. And if you recall, free throw shooting often is a better indicator to what you can do as a three-point shooter in the pros than just actually three-point shooting. So it'll be interesting to see where he plays. 220 pounds, decent wingspan, decent standing reach. Can he be slide to a small ball 4? That's going to be an interesting player. Dallas has picked him up in Miles Bridges out of Michigan State. Back on the clock now is Adam Mares out of Denver. Let's check in and find out where the 14th pick goes. They have not traded it to Utah. Don't worry, Nugget fans.
My name is Adam Muddes, and I host the Locked On Nuggets podcast, and I'll be representing the Denver Nuggets in this mock draft. Coming into the draft, the Denver Nuggets may need is for length and defense, primarily at the small forward position. They'll be looking for players both in free agency and through the draft who have length to guard multiple positions and are known as the type of defenders that can both be on-ball stoppers as well as help protect the rim for Nikola Jokic. I think the best case scenario for the Denver Nuggets is if a player like Kevin Knox or Miles Bridges falls to 14. Mock drafts have had both of those guys somewhere right around the 14th pick. Early on, Kevin Knox was considered somewhere in the 14 to 18 range, Miles Bridges top 10. But over the last couple of weeks, it seems that Knox has risen, and in his place, Miles Bridges has been the player to fall. I suspect there's a decent chance, probably better than 50%, that one of those two guys will be available when Denver is selecting 14th next week. If both of those guys are off of the board, I think that Denver would probably either look to trade that pick back. There were reports earlier that the Nuggets were willing to part with their 14th pick if they were able to get off of Kenneth Faried's contract. Kenneth Faried is owed $13 million for next season, but he is out of the rotation, and if the Nuggets intend to sign Nikola Jokic this offseason, which they do, as well as hope to re-sign Will Barton, they would have to get off of Faried's contract at the draft. However, I don't think Denver would want to trade the pick and not get anything back. I think they would look to only move back in the draft, maybe to the late teens, early 20s, or maybe even to the very end of the first round. I don't think it would make sense for them to trade out of the first round entirely, and I think they have other pieces that maybe they could use to get Faried moved. Malik Beasley being one of them. Hernan Gomez, Leiden, maybe even Trey Lyles if they feel that they have enough players, and especially young players at that power forward position. Lots of teams in the mock draft called willing to trade the 14th pick, but all of them were for second-round picks, and I just don't think that is something that Denver should do, and it's certainly not something myself hosting the Nuggets pick in this mock draft would do. I took Zaire Smith, and I already regret that pick. You know, I'm not a draft guy, and my turn to pick was before I had a chance to scout Zaire, so I went with what was sort of the mock draft consensus there. But as I've gotten more into it and have written about him this week on DenverStiffs.com, he's really not a player I like, and I don't know that he necessarily fits for the Nuggets. The first thing being, he's 6'4". I got a chance to interview him when he worked out in Denver, and, you know, I'm 6'5". We're about eye to eye. I think about an inch taller than him. I know some reports had him at being 6'3", but I think he looks about the same height as Gary Harris. But unfortunately, with Harris and Murray in the backcourt, I don't think the Nuggets need to continue to draft players who can only guard two positions. I think they need more versatility, even if they are only looking at backcourt players. I think guys like Josh Okogie, Troy Brown Jr., Keita Bates-Diop, and even Jacob Evans might be better fits for the Nuggets at 14. So had I had a mulligan, I probably would have gone with those players in that order. But Zaire does provide some interesting defensive potential. His defensive box plus minus of 6.4 his freshman season is similar to Marcus Smart, another player that has a long wingspan, strong, solid base who could defend much bigger than his size. But I don't know that Zaire projects to be quite the elite level defender that Marcus Smart is. Like Smart, I think Zaire Smith is a very unique player, and with that uniqueness, sort of that unicorn type style of play, maybe he can carve out a niche that makes him difficult to scheme against. But I don't see that happening. His offensive game is pretty raw. And although Nikola Jokic has turned Emmanuel Mudiay into a starter on the number one led offense for 4 months, I think you would be testing the Jokic magic by trying to pair him with a player like Zaire Smith, who is a decent set shooter, but can't put the ball on the floor, has almost no handle at all, struggles to finish in traffic, struggles to finish with finesse. I think his offensive game is as raw as it comes in the first round of this draft. So placing him in the Nuggets rotation, I think, would really test the limits of what that offense could do. Nonetheless, he does have an incredible amount of upside, great attitude and work ethic by all accounts, and those are the type of players Denver has tried to build their roster in the rebuild. Now that their rebuild is over and they're ready to try to make the playoffs, I'm not sure that they value that as highly, but he certainly would fit in with the culture the Nuggets have cultivated over the last 3 seasons.
Well, I hope Adam Modest never hosts a post-press conference as a GM and admitting he made a mulligan. I don't think he'd hold his job well. I don't think talk radio would treat him well. I think that would be a tough scenario right there for Adam Modest if he's going to his post-draft press conferences. Actually, I wish I had a mulligan, but he just did it here in the mock draft. So craziness all about. He takes Zaire Smith. Let's get Jeremy Woo's take on the Texas Tech athlete.
Zaire Smith is one of the big risks of this draft, and I think it's likely he'll go between 10 and 20. I think it's a fair gamble, but the fact of the matter is this is a guy who is not given us much of a sample size offensively. You watch him and it's clear he knows what he's doing, but he's playing. This year at Texas Tech he played mostly as a 3 or a 4, sort of out of position, and the reason he can do that is because he's so athletic, and I think that's what teams love about him is that athleticism. I think he's a little bit under 6'3" in shoes. That's what he measured at the combine, which is, means he's probably going to have to be a 2 guard. But, he can play bigger. He can really jump. Just the big concern is what type of offensive skill set does he really have? How good of a 3-point shooter is he? Can he put the ball on the floor and create his own shot? And I think he's behind in those areas. So if you're taking him, I think, you're hoping he becomes a really good sort of complimentary guy with the athletic ability to sort of star in his role. But I don't know. I don't know if his upside is that much greater than some of these other players, just because of where he is offensively.
Having watched Zaire Smith a few times, Texas Tech played a lot of really good teams, Kansas and Oklahoma. And so you watched him. He did some really impressive things defensively. Adam mentioned Marcus Smart. I don't know if that's the answer. And athletically, he's over the top and literally over the top of the rim most of the time. He grabs about 58% of his rebounds as offensive rebounds because he is just crashing in and playing over the rim. This is an incredible athlete. That's going to be a career that is certainly worth watching and going to be interesting to see as it plays out, because if he develops the skills, his athleticism is going to make Adam Modest say, I meant to draft him. I really meant to draft him, is what he's going to say. All right, we're 2 picks in. Dallas and Denver are in the books. We've got Washington, Phoenix, Milwaukee, and San Antonio all coming up next. Something interesting has begun to happen in this mock draft with the way Trae Young went early and then Michael Porter dropping in New York, not taking a guard. Colin Sexton out of Alabama has slid. Shai Gilgeous-Alexander was a surprise pick. Most people have Sexton ahead of Alexander. But in this case, the Clippers took Gilgeous-Alexander first. Then when Miles Bridges went, Dallas has Dennis Smith. They don't really need a point guard. Denver took Zaire Smith. They don't really need a point guard in Jamal Murray. Washington's now on the board, John Wall. Phoenix, they took Luka Doncic. San Antonio has Derek White from last year, DeJounte Murray. They also have Tony Parker probably back. Atlanta maybe is where is this? If one of these point guards slides in this draft, where is the backstop for them to stop? That gets to be a pretty interesting story that is developing in this draft. But right now, Washington is on the board. Let's head over to the Washington Wizards NBA draft headquarters.
What's up, guys? Thanks for checking out the Locked On Wizards podcast, part of the Locked On NBA network, your team every day. We're in the war room. We're about to make our pick, about to make our choice, and kind of go into the draft, joined by my co-hosts, Becca Winkert. What's up, Becca?
Hey, Ian. How's it going?
The one and only Arthur Renault. What's up, Arthur?
What's up, guys? Let's trade away our picks for some cash considerations.
Cash consideration.
That is a no.
The only wizard that will be making the Hall of Fame anytime soon. Cash considerations. All right, so we're in the war room. I guess hypothetically we're on the clock. Arthur, we'll start with you. What is the Washington Wizards' biggest needs going into this draft?
We need a young, athletic big that can complement our starting backcourt, not demand many touches, and just run the floor and run in transition.
I agree. I think getting a center who can run up and down the floor and be an asset on both ends, so in transition with John Wall and Bradley Beal, kind of like that lob target. So I think we all kind of agree there. Is there a dream scenario for you guys at all as far as moving up in the draft to pick someone, maybe making a trade, another star in return? Like, what's the dream scenario? What are you thinking?
Well, in a dream scenario for us, I think it would be critical for us to get a third all-star or a third, superstar to help us carry the team into the playoffs. But since that's not the most realistic thing, like I said before, due to our salary cap, the max contracts that we have, it might be too big to get rid of them. I think, we should be banking on hopefully getting lucky and getting someone who could come in and help the team.
Getting a young, talented player who's going to be impactful, hopefully sooner rather than later, and who fits with the team well. But I'm also totally down to get Kawhi Leonard back, or some blockbuster trade where you get that. You don't get rid of John Wall or Bradley Beal or John Wall and Otto Porter. You give up one of the three and get like a superstar back. That would get me super excited. So considering how the draft has played out so far, Becca, what are you considering? I mean, Doncic with the first pick, the Sacramento Kings took DeAndre Ayton, of course. And then from there, it's kind of a crapshoot. The guys, a lot of the players that we were interested in, to include Lonnie Walker and to include like a pipe dream like Mo Bamba and my guy, Kevin Knox out of Kentucky, they're gone. Everything that's happened so far in this mock draft, do you guys feel like a lot of the players I know that we wanted personally, they're already gone? What do you guys think? Becca, we'll start with you.
A guy like Williams would be beneficial for us. It comes down to athleticism and his wingspan and a lot of other things that he has that we need, especially on the defensive end, just defending the paint in general. I think that it would be good for us.
Yeah. Arthur, I know your Twitter handle is District Mamba. Are you bummed out that Mo Bamba's gone?
Yeah, because we could always use Mo Bamba. But, yeah, I just had to say it. I was getting ready for that all day. But, I think we really need to rejuvenate our center position with someone that's athletic.
Yeah, I agree with both of you. Were there any trade possibilities, guys? The Locked On Mavericks blog did reach out to you, Becca. They were going to give us Powell in exchange for Jan Mahimi and the 15th pick, right?
Yes, that's exactly right. They want to give us Dwight Powell for Jan Mahimi and the 15th pick. For us, that would be not a bad trade for us, but we just did not want to give up our pick. We wanted to kind of get some young talent on our squad. So
we passed on that. And then, Arthur, I know David reached out to you, David Locke from Locked On Jazz, and the voice of the Utah Jazz. What was he even proposing to you?
His selling point in the trade discussions, he was interested in acquiring Otto Porter and the pick from us in exchange for basically expiring contracts. So their angle was to help alleviate our cap situation. In that case, if I have the Otto Porter and the team's pick for a bunch of expiring contracts, or Becca's deal with the Mavericks, for Jan Mahimi and the 15th pick for Dwight Powell, I'm taking the Mavericks deal. Trading Otto Porter for cap relief is not something that we should be looking at all.
No, I agree. The team is very, very talented on the top end with John Wall, Bradley Beal, Otto Porter. They complement each other really well. So we didn't want to give up one of those pieces. Guys, let's go ahead and get into who we are taking, and then we'll do a quick breakdown of the player. With the 15th pick in the 2018 NBA Draft, the Washington Wizards select... Someone drum roll real quick. Someone do it real quick, drum roll. It's Robert Williams. Robert Williams from Texas A&M. All right, so kind of surprised, to be honest, that he slid this far. But to have Robert Williams drop to 15 is kind of what a lot of Wizards fans wanted anyway. For anyone who doesn't know, just 6'9", 6'10", probably by the end of next year because he's still growing. He's going to be 21, I think, in October. Got a 7'4" wingspan. He's right about 240 pounds, so he's already a powerful guy. Arthur, he is the guy you kind of talked about. He's a rim runner. He's going to get putback dunks or rebounds, and then he's a quick leaper, so he'll go right back up. He looks to finish over and through people. He's not kind of like a lot of the centers we have right now on the roster where they're just going to maybe try to lay it up and get it off the backboard real quick. because they don't have a lot of jumping ability. This guy, Robert Williams, is the opposite of that. He's going to jump over people and go through people violently. Not a good shooter. Very bad free throw shooter. We're talking Drummond, Shaquille O'Neal, DeAndre Jordan type level of free throw shooter. So liability at the end of a game. But defensively, can guard the 2, the 3, the 4, and the 5 from the jump. Even at the NBA level, in my opinion. Has a super low stance. He moves his feet really well laterally. He uses his length to his advantage. He closes out on shooters. He blocks jump shots. Switchability. Guys, we have talked about it ad nauseum. We don't have any centers who are switchable. This is a guy who's basically kind of like Clint Capella. Putback dunks, lob target in transition and on the pick and roll from John Wall and whoever's running the screen and roll with him. And then defensively, switchable. He can guard multiple positions. Crazy help defender, insane length, erases shots at the rim. What do you think, Becca?
I'm super excited about it. The defensive effort, so athletic. I'm really excited about it. The only thing that I'll say is he's not a great free throw shooter, but other than that, I mean, he can play center or power forward, and I think that's going to be great news for the Wizards team. Yeah, I mean, to wrap up, I agree. I'm super excited. I don't know if he starts right away. He might be a year away from something like that. He needs to develop a few skills. He's kind of undisciplined defensively. He wants to block everything. He's got, think like JaVale McGee syndrome. With that being said, you get a guy who probably for the first time in a decade, people will be playing against the Wizards and be thinking twice about, oh, can I drive into the paint right now? Like, can I go attack the basket? Because right now, guys are looking at Marcin Gortat down there, and they're just salivating. This is going to be someone who could, kind of like you said, Becca, set the tone and change the makeup of the team entirely and really give them a defensive anchor that they've maybe never had. Thanks for checking it out, guys. Give us a follow. Follow the show at Locked On Wizards. Follow Becca at Becca MVP. Arthur can be found at District Mamba, and you can follow myself at TheRealIan_E. Let's throw it back to you, David.
Thanks very much to Ian. Appreciate that very much. Beck actually does a bunch of work for NASA as well. Yeah, like you're a rocket scientist. She might actually be. Enough of that. All right. Let's get the breakdown of Robert Williams, Texas A&M big man, and see what Jeremy Woo of Sports Illustrated says about Robert Williams.
Robert Williams definitely has the talent to be a starting caliber center. You look at him play, he's a very natural rim runner. He'll finish above the rim. He's a very good offensive rebounder. Will catch lobs. I think the hope is that, you look at the success that Clint Capella has had in a very focused role for Houston in that specific sense. And I think that Williams is a guy who is a good candidate to do a similar job in the NBA. I think teams have concerns. It was weird that he skipped the combine, not being a guaranteed, top pick. I think that, there's always been concerns about his motor, how badly he wants to be great. And I think that's what will ultimately lead to him falling in the draft a little bit. I think it's possible he slips out of the lottery. But honestly, anywhere in that range of the draft, I think he's good value if you think that you can develop him. He does have the tools that are really appealing. And I think there's a chance that he ends up being a guy where you're scratching your head, if he maximizes his talent and he goes to the right situation where it's like, why didn't we try that?
In the draft that we're having take place right now, Colin Sexton has slid, partially because Shai Gilgeous-Alexander went ahead of him. If you look at it, it's not crazy, though, that Philadelphia, Charlotte, Clippers, Dallas, Denver, Washington all pass on point guards. Is there a chance that one of these 2 point guards will slide on draft night?
I think there is. I think if you're looking at the Clippers, if the Clippers keep their pick, that's probably a sweet spot for one of them. I think Sexton may have a chance. His best case scenario is if Trae Young is gone before it gets to the Cavaliers and Knicks. I think they'll both look at him. But it wouldn't surprise me if those 2 teams go different directions at those picks. And if that happens, I could see him fall. And I think Washington would probably look at him pretty hard at 15. But if they don't take him, maybe Phoenix at 16. I think that's probably about as far as he'd flip is 15, 16, realistically.
We'll keep an eye on Colin Sexton, Alabama. That's the story of part 3 of this mock draft, is the way he is slipping. Jake Madison hosts the Wednesday edition of Locked On NBA with John Corrales. Josh Lloyd hosts the Locked On Fantasy Basketball Show, as well as every Monday he hosts Locked On NBA with the local experts on the biggest stories. Let's head over and see what they have seen so far in the latest 3 picks of the NBA mock draft of the Locked On Podcast Network.
Thanks, David. We have our first traded pick here with the Dallas Mavericks sending Wesley Matthews to the LA Clippers in exchange for Danilo Gallinari and pick 13. So Dallas did make that selection there at pick 13. They got Miles Bridges, who appears to have been the biggest slider so far in this mock draft. Bridges was a guy who had top 10 upside for last season, surprisingly came back into the draft. I think it's a really strong pick. We've talked about it already. Wing players, guys who can hit threes, can defend at multiple positions and show some ability to push up positions. They're really, really valuable, and I think that's a great value for Dallas to get him there.
Yeah, this is a good trade for Dallas, especially if they're being patient on their timeline for how they want to grow and develop this team. So great value for them. You know, this Bridges is a strong scorer and rebounder. He's a bit undersized for what you'd like, but in today's faster paced, smaller NBA, I think he can definitely thrive. So if Dallas is kind of making that youthful transition to getting out and running, doing different things, I really like this move for them.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, but it is I'd say it's clearly the best option there on the board. Now, with the last of the lottery selections, the Nuggets went with Zaire Smith out of Texas Tech, a phenomenal athlete, a guy who obviously needs to bring more offensively. But on this Denver team, he doesn't need to do that. Jamal Murray, Gary Harrison, of course, Nikola Jokic, and Paul Millsap are already entrenched in that starting lineup. And adding someone who could play perhaps the role that Torrey Craig played a little bit for Michael Malone last season, and obviously Malone really loved what Craig could do, but a guy who can be athletic, guard multiple positions. This is a team that's really looking to push to the playoffs, of course, and look, I think they have to take that swing on a guy who fits well with their existing star talent.
Yeah, you summed it up perfectly. It's a bit of boom or bust because you could say this is a little bit high, but for a guy who doesn't really generate much of his own offense, he just has no need to do that whatsoever in Denver, so it fits exactly what they're trying to do.
The last guy here out of this trio is the Washington Wizards, selecting Robert Williams out of Texas A&M, another guy who probably we're surprised to have seen go back to college. Didn't really take necessarily huge steps forward. He's a horrible free throw shooter. I'm so out on big men in this zone of NBA drafts. I'd rather just get wings and then get my big men much later on. And I don't think the difference between a guy like this and a guy you can get in the 20s is all that much different. They do have problems at centre with Machin Gortat and Jan Mahinmi, but I'm not the biggest fan of taking a big man at this point, especially one as limited as what Williams is with his offensive ability.
Yeah, he's really just a rim running big, which maybe is a good thing to pair with Wall, and they kind of upgrade at athleticism with this selection. But this guy also has a lot of question marks around him on the mental side of things. He skipped the combine. He changed agents like a month before everything started. So you got to kind of wonder what's going on there, and that might kind of scare you off a little bit when you factor in that this position isn't just as of need in the NBA as a whole.
3 picks remaining in this edition of the draft. Right now, the Phoenix Suns are back on the board. The guys stunned the draft in day one, taking Luka Doncic number 1. Let's see what the guys do in the Valley of the Sun now as we head over to their NBA Draft War Room.
Alrighty, the Phoenix Suns are back on the clock again with the 16th overall pick, and unfortunately, looking at the board right now, we had a lot of guys we were looking forward to, possibly Zaire Smith, Kevin Knox, for example. They were off the board. A lot of guys in the last 5 or 6 picks we were really targeting went off the board. But, Brendan, I know you are a really big fan of the guy we selected here. We had a little bit of discussion as far as trade goes. We were talking to Dallas a little bit, talking to Washington, Milwaukee, a couple of other teams. We tried to talk to Denver as well, get the 14th overall pick, but they declined on that. But we ended up staying at 16th overall, and we went with Brendan's best player available and also my best player available with this scenario. And we also, again, we're doing high fives in the war room again because we believe that by far the best player available. Not only that, but alongside Luka Doncic, who we took number 1 overall, we believe that he is the best fit as far as the modern trend of the Phoenix Suns roster is going, and that is Oregon forward / point guard / wing everything pretty much, Troy Brown. So, Brendan, for the people who aren't really familiar with Troy Brown, I'm a pretty big fan of him. Was a point guard all throughout high school, so the playmaking ability is there as far as secondary playmaking goes. He can also hit from all 3 levels. There's still some development with the shooting, but he's very versatile on defense and on offense, so that really stood out to us. So, but for the people that are listening in, Brendan, just what's your thoughts on Troy Brown as a whole? Because from a Suns point of view, he's a really interesting prospect.
Yeah, we're kind of doubling down in a way, playing as the Suns here with that mold of player. So, I think there's a common perception with Suns fans, maybe even with people looking at Phoenix and what they might do, that, with the big men available at the top, if they were to take one of those, then they'd probably go guard. with the 16th pick. We're doing kind of the opposite, so we're doubling down with ball handling, doubling down on that versatility. Brown's somebody who is, like you mentioned, a playmaker at a pretty, wing type of size, can guard multiple positions, can probably play on and off the ball pretty well in the NBA. Shooting is a question, but he has such a solid feel for the game. Even on a really talent-depleted Oregon roster this year, was able to shine in a few games, and anytime he touched the ball, you kind of just felt the offense breathe a sigh of relief. Even with the typical freshman mistakes that he made, he's very young. He'll continue to grow, but you watch him and you feel good about the fact that he's going to be a good decision maker. He's going to be able to do and contribute in a lot of different ways for an NBA team. So it might seem like an overlap with Doncic, but I think they can both survive together, and you can never have too many of that type of player.
100% I agree with you there. And on my board we were looking at before we took our selection, I was thinking between Troy Brown, not only him because we have Luka Doncic on board, so we need a need for a big. I was considering pretty heavily Mitchell Robinson as well, the high school big, but we ended up going in the direction of Troy Brown for safety reasons, and also we believe he's the best player available on our board. So the Phoenix Suns are doubling down on versatility and on both sides of the ball with Luka Doncic and Troy Brown, and we're hoping to build a really modern vision of what we see today in the playoffs of Golden State, Boston, Houston, for example, of those teams that are really trying to build towards that modern trend in the NBA and going not really positionless basketball, but have as many creators and shot creators and plus defenders on the floor as possible. And we believe that going in the direction of Troy Brown and Luka Doncic up top at number 1 does that. So the Phoenix Suns, Brendan Clean and I are going to lock in Troy Brown of Oregon, number 16 overall.
Brown's a really interesting prospect because what the guys talked about. He played point guard, almost thinks he's a point guard, acts like a point guard. His testing numbers are not elite at all. And so it's surprising. You think of him just naturally because of his length and everything about him that he is actually an elite athlete. It's not clear that that's actually true. You look at him and he's McDonald's All-American, I believe. He was a highly thought of recruit. He's 6'6" with a 6'10" and a quarter wingspan, but that's not entirely clear that he's actually this above average elite athlete when you look at some of the numbers. Let's get a better analysis from Jeremy Wu, Sports Illustrated.
Troy Brown is a good prospect for the modern game. He has good size. He's got a good body. He's 6'7". He's rangy. He covers ground. He'll defend. I think, the issue with him has always been aggressiveness. But he did grow up playing point guard. He's comfortable with the ball in his hands. He's a guy who's the ball mover, not selfish. If you're taking him, you know that you need to develop him offensively. You know that you need to find a role for him. He needs to become a better three-point shooter. I think there's some risk here if he doesn't, get the three-point shot down. But bigger wings like him who are athletic and can guard a couple of different positions and can pass and have a feel, I think are very valuable in today's NBA. So, I think Troy Brown, is a pretty justifiable first-round pick. I don't know if he's going to capitalize on that. I'm not sure what his ceiling is if he doesn't become, improve as a scorer. But he does have things going for him that make sense in a role.
We are clearly at the point of the draft where things are not a sure thing anymore. Milwaukee and San Antonio still to come on today's edition. And remember, a Reddit AMA at 2 o'clock Eastern talking about the picks that were made in today's mock draft. The Locked On Podcast Network covers every NBA and NFL team, plus a growing list of Major League Baseball teams. So when a big story breaks and you want the local experts, you go to the Locked On Podcast Network. Where? At LockedOnSports.com. Bookmark LockedOnSports.com. It's the home for your local experts on all the biggest stories. LockedOnSports.com.
It's the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Mike Budenholzer is the new head coach in Milwaukee. Let's go to Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and find out from the guys of Locked On Bucks what they're going to do in the Bucks War Room.
Eric Name from Locked On Bucks here representing the Milwaukee Bucks at number 17 and looking at what this pick could do and exactly what the Bucks might need. It's actually funny. We actually just had this conversation on Locked On Bucks with me and the founder of Brew Hoop, Frank Madden. Frank and I have been arguing about this, about need and how you kind of conceptualize that in the modern NBA. And what are you thinking about? Are you thinking about what your need is now? Or are you thinking about it in a couple of years? How do you attempt to figure out exactly what your need is? And I'm of the belief that you can never have enough wings, and wing, it would be where I would go as far as what the Bucks need is. I think you always need more. You always need to find those guys that can shoot threes, can play some defense, can create a little bit. That's kind of what I think. Frank, on the other hand, thinks point guard is the position of need for the long term here for the Milwaukee Bucks. And like I said, we already recorded a full podcast on that if you want to listen to that argument. Pretty entertaining stuff. So biggest need, I think we have a little bit of a disagreement there. Dream scenario for the Bucks at 17, I think that's a little bit hard to parse, just because I think if there's any way that like a guy like Trae Young can fall to 17, sure, that'd be the dream scenario, but that seems incredibly unlikely. So I'd say let's take that one off the board. I think the other dream scenario would be either of the Bridges falling to the Bucks at 17. Again, I don't know if that is all that likely, just because those two guys seem to have a really big support system around the league, and people really seem to like each of those guys as prospects. So that seems unlikely. So I'd say those two wouldn't. Maybe a Michael Porter Jr. if there are concerns about the back. That would be the upper level talent that, the Bucks are still looking for, still trying to find who that guy would be for their, top of the line talent. They are still trying to find one of those. So any of those situations to me would end up being their dream scenario. And I guess for us, as we sort of talked through this, we went back to our conversation about, are we looking more for point guards? Are we looking more for wing players? And I guess kind of the conversation that we had was about Colin Sexton. He's the one that I think is sort of falling in our draft, and we just didn't believe in Sexton enough to go there. That just wasn't something that we thought. I think there's enough questions about how much he needs the ball, what he is really about. Does he fit with Giannis? Because we always talk about on the podcast the fact that rosters overturn. It's just you turn over a new roster all the time. Those players are always coming in and out. But if there's one constant in Milwaukee, it is Giannis Antetokounmpo. He is not going anywhere. And to have a first-round pick that potentially might not fit with him in Colin Sexton, we just didn't think it made any sense. And then, we kind of looked at some of those other guys on the wing, but there was a number of guys. You look at Herter, D'Anthony Melton, Elio Kobo. There was some other guys that we ended up thinking about as well. We didn't really look at trade possibilities, and part of that reason, I think, is just this Bucks roster. There really isn't a ton to trade. We're open, and we told the rest of the GMs that we'd be open to trading anyone on the roster not named Giannis Antetokounmpo and probably not Chris Middleton. But when you look at this Bucks roster, there just really isn't a ton of assets there. Maybe someone is interested in Malcolm Brogdon, but I think he might get a little bit underappreciated around the league, so not a lot there. Then they have some brutal contracts in Henson and Delly that, we would like to move off of to create some cap space, but at the same time, I don't think anyone in this exercise was going to do that without getting a first-round pick, and that just didn't seem like something that we'd want to do. So ultimately, we decided on taking Kevin Herter from Maryland, and I think a lot of it was because of the endorsement he received from our guy Cole Swicker from the Stepien, who we had on the podcast earlier, I guess last week at this point. We had him on the podcast, and he was really talking about with Herter, the big thing with him is obviously the size, but the ability to catch and shoot, but also the ability to, be on the move and catch and shoot, be able to do something off of that. Just the variety in which he can do all those things. As you're looking to put together a roster around Giannis Antetokounmpo, I think the big thing is always shooting and having some ability to get your shot in a number of different ways, to get that three-point shot off, coming off screens, being able to attack a little bit off the dribble there. So Kevin Herter is who we ended up going with at number 17 for the Milwaukee Bucks. For Locked On Bucks, I'm Eric Name. Come and join me and Frank Mann at any time here on Locked On Bucks.
And Colin Sexton's slide continues. The Alabama product, thought of at one point as a possible top 10 pick, is still on the board. And understandably so, frankly, from a lot of these teams. Kevin Herter out of Maryland was the pick there. Let's get from Jeremy Woo his thoughts on the Terrapin.
Kevin Huerter is a guy who really, really did a lot for himself during the pre-draft process. Probably the most notable riser as a guy who was sort of not sure if he should come in or go back to Maryland, and is now likely to be a top 25 pick. When you're that big and can really shoot the ball like him, clearly you're an NBA prospect, and teams think he'll be able to play in the league for a long time as long as he goes to the right place. I think the question with him athletically, how good of an athlete is he? I think he is passable, but some might disagree with me. But he needs to be able to stay on the floor on defense. But he can move the ball. He's a smart player. Will really shoot it. I think there's reason for optimism that you're looking for help on the wing.
Well, Jeremy's exactly right. Herter's the hot guy right now. He stands at about 6'7" and a quarter. His reach is the exact same as his wingspan is the exact same as his reach, which is pretty unusual. He did hit 42% of his threes. He did score 15 points a game. But is this a Nick Stauskas rise, which turned out to not be a very smart one? Is this a Lindsey Hunter rise of a few years ago? He, more than anyone else, has just climbed up the draft boards here, and it will be interesting to see whether or not 5 years from now that momentum was justified for what it is. There is a major story in our mock draft, and that is the slide of Colin Sexton. Let's see if it ends as we head down to San Antonio, Texas. DeJounte Murray, Derek White, Patty Mills. Do they still just take best player available? Let's go to the San Antonio Spurs NBA draft headquarters.
Hey there, this is Jeff Garcia, host of Locked On Spurs. The San Antonio Spurs have the number 18 pick in the upcoming NBA draft, their highest pick in quite some time. Heading into the draft, I would have to say the Spurs' biggest need right now is at the guard position. DeJounte Murray is an up-and-coming guard in the NBA, but he still needs seasoning and will likely once again be taking over the point guard range. However, with longtime Spur Tony Parker on the back end of his career, we do not know what's going to happen with the future of Manu Ginobili, whether he will retire or not. The Spurs definitely need some help at the guard spot. The dream scenario for San Antonio would be that DeJounte Murray has a breakout season and becomes exactly what the Spurs are hoping he'll be in his third season. And Tony Parker rebounds from that injury and is completely healed 100%. Last season, he did rush back from his surgery to repair his quadricep muscle. However, he was in and out throughout the season, and at the end of the season did admit that he may have rushed it too much, which likely hampered some of his play throughout the season. And that would have to be the biggest decision for me heading into this mock draft here on the Locked On NBA Network. It's simply getting younger at the guard position for San Antonio. Let's face it, these Spurs are needing to keep up with the Joneses, so to speak, in the NBA. They do have a promising young point guard, DeJounte Murray, but outside of him, that's really much it. Now, Patty Mills, what does he really give you? He's not exactly a spring chicken. And, of course, I mentioned Tony Parker and the future of Manu Ginobili. And with that, I was stuck between Kyrie Thomas out of Creighton and Colin Sexton out of Alabama, the freshman. Looking at Kyrie Thomas, I like what he has. He's a shooting guard. He can play both positions. And in this day and age, having a big guard in the NBA would behoove the San Antonio Spurs. He's kind of a late bloomer, but I also like the fact that he's a junior, an older player in this draft pool. And I think he'd be, at least mentally and probably physically as well, be more NBA ready than the young freshman Sexton. And the Spurs definitely love his length. I think they would love that in their defensive schemes. You're looking at DeJounte Murray. He has a tremendous wingspan. You're looking at Kyrie Thomas. He has a wingspan as well. I liked his determination and his competitiveness while at Creighton. He has a very controlled game, stays on balance, and he doesn't rattle easily. And I think that type of b-ball IQ, that balance in his game would behoove the San Antonio Spurs. As for Colin Sexton, well, I gotta like the fact that he's young. The Spurs definitely need to get younger at that position. He has solid tools for a point guard. He's a 6'2" guard with a 6.6 wingspan. You gotta love that. And very explosive. I think the transition game will help Sexton in the NBA, and he was very good at that, especially the fact that he doesn't really need a lot of ball screens to get to the rim. And again, this is San Antonio, so you got to talk about defense, and he does bring that. He does have a competitive defensiveness mindset in his game. He can really show that he has active hands, and he's not afraid to defend with physicality. I got to like that. Now, obviously, on the downside, he is very young. He's just a kid. He's going to be playing with the likes of Kawhi Leonard, hopefully, LaMarcus Aldridge, Pau Gasol, Manu Ginobili, hopefully. So I think with Popovich having a reputation of really relegating rookies to the bench, just look at Derek White last season, that may not work well in his favor if he wants to get some time on the court. Nevertheless, I'm going to go with Colin Sexton, the freshman out of Alabama. In the end, I like the youth. I like the fact that it's just simply that defensiveness. I think the Spurs need that and that explosiveness in transition. The Spurs lack that. Yes, they had some of that with DeJounte Murray, but once he got into foul trouble or maybe didn't play a game because he was in the doghouse, the Spurs' depth at explosive point guards pretty much went down the tubes. Parker, Patty Mills, doesn't really scream athletic and out in the open court type of player. I like, again, the youth movement that the Spurs can use with him, and let him groom out in Austin and really know what the Spurs system is like with the G League Spurs. And with that, the Spurs pick Colin Sexton.
So the Colin Sexton slide ends. Let's see what Jeremy Wu thinks about how far Sexton slid and whether he can be a starting point guard in the NBA.
I'm stunned that Sexton has fallen this far, but I can understand the concerns. I have my concerns about him just in terms of how much better is he going to make his teammates. I think that's the big question. How much of it is for him is about making teammates better, how much of it is about his own numbers. But he's known as a guy who works hard. From what I've heard, teams think he will continue to improve. And I think he's a guy who will be able to definitely get downhill, get into the paint. And it's particularly, with your second unit, you need a guy who can, get into the paint, attack the defense, and make things happen, make the defense move. And I think Sexton is one of those guys. It's fair to wonder whether he'll be a starting point guard. I think if he becomes more of a pass first guy in certain situations, he can do it. But the talent is definitely there, and I think he will be able to score. So again, it depends who you are and sort of what type of role you're going to put him into. If you have to start him right away, he's going to go out there and make mistakes. But if you have time to sort of groom him into a role, I think he can be very good.
We have reached the final pick of today's edition. It started with a 13th pick going to Dallas with Miles Bridges. Denver took Zaire Smith reluctantly. Washington went 15 to Robert Williams. Phoenix feels great about their day of Troy Brown and Luka Doncic, number 1. Milwaukee takes Kevin Huerter. San Antonio ended the slide of Colin Sexton. Let's go check in with Jake Madison and Josh Lloyd. Jake hosts the Wednesday edition of Locked On NBA, and Josh Lloyd hosts Locked On Fantasy Basketball, as well as the Monday edition, where he talks with the local experts on the biggest stories. Let's see what these guys think of the 6 picks we've seen today.
Thanks, Dave. It's been a very interesting mock draft so far. Another 3 picks for us to have a look at here. Phoenix has their second selection in the draft, and they went with Troy Brown out of Oregon. Again, getting wing players, getting guards is really important in the NBA. It's hard to fault too much here at this selection for getting Troy Brown. There are other guys I probably liked a little bit better. One player who we'll talk about a little bit later I would have preferred at this position, but Troy Brown out of Oregon, I think it's a fine pick.
Yeah, I think that's kind of the way to say it. This is a guy who can pass, who can defend. He's versatile. He's got good size. It just it fits what they're trying to do, which is just assemble young talent. And now you get this guy. You've got the backcourt set. You can work on the front court, and we've learned that's a little bit more interchangeable. And now you get a guy on the wing who can defend, so you're kind of 2/3 of the way there, maybe.
The problem with Brown is he was such a poor 3-point shooter last season, but he did play some point guard. Not that they're going to need too much of that with Doncic here being selected by Phoenix in this mock, and of course Devin Booker still around. But that 3-point shooting is a little bit of a concern. Now the next pick, the Milwaukee Bucks selected Kevin Huerter of Maryland, but of course after this mock draft was completed, the news came out about Huerter's injury. Jake, what's the situation with his hand?
Yeah, it sounds like, I forget if it's the left or the right, but he tore some ligaments, is going to need surgery. He's going to be out for 2 months, which frankly isn't that bad. Look, we talked about how Troy Brown isn't much of a shooter. Well, this guy is, and more shooters are never a bad thing. Also, shooters that aren't kind of black holes on offense. When the ball hits their hands, they're going to shoot. This guy can still move the ball. So overall, if you're just discounting the surgery, and that shouldn't really impact too much here, I like this pick for him. Why not? More shooters around Giannis is never a bad thing.
Yeah, love it. And exactly what you said. Yeah, putting it alongside Giannis and depends on what happens with Jabari Parker and Eric Bledsoe. These are not guys who are considered great shooters, but this is what Huerter can do. He can move the ball a bit. He plays alongside a guy with similar skill set with Chris Middleton there. Yeah, you're not drafting for production in the next 2 months. You're drafting for the next 10 years, hopefully. So if he's got a wrist injury for the next 2 months, I don't really think it should have any impact at all. And I'm not sure how the Bucks guys would feel about this, but if they made this selection with that injury news at hand, I'm not sure they would change too much. The 18th pick was the San Antonio Spurs taking Colin Sexton. Love this pick. So we know about Sexton's tenacity, his competitiveness. The San Antonio Spurs have got DeJounte Murray as an all-defensive point guard there, but adding another guy with the aging Tony Parker, who may not even be back for this team, I think it's a great pick. And Sexton has a real chance to be going as high as the 9th pick in the real NBA draft. So despite his limitations, getting him at 18, it's really hard to pass up.
No, you could see Colin Sexton going to maybe Cleveland or something like that, which also makes some sense there too. So getting him at 18 is great. This is a guy who can get downhill and attack. He's got that strong, well-known work ethic, which I think fits in with the Spurs organization and their philosophy. Yeah, defensively and size-wise, he's lacking, and that might hurt him. It might be part of the reason he slid here. But man, can you imagine if you could combine Sexton and Murray into like maybe the ultimate guard?
Yeah, and the thing with Sexton is part of his, I guess, downside or the way that he played last year is he took just poor shots, ill-advised shots, bad shot selection. You don't see that happening in San Antonio. That's not going to be tolerated for more than 5 seconds. So I think that is the team that can beat that sort of tendency out of him, and it couldn't have happened for him to go to a better situation to actually really harness all those other skills and get rid of the bad one. So really strong pick there for the Spurs at pick 18.
That wraps up our day 3 of coverage of the mock draft. Miles Bridges going 13 to Dallas, acquired in the trade. Zaire Smith, 14 to Denver. Robert Williams, 15 to Washington. Troy Brown, 16 to Phoenix. Kevin Huerter, 17. And Colin Sexton at 18. When we come back on Monday, Atlanta, Minnesota, Utah, Chicago, Indiana, all on the board. Some pretty darn good players still floating around. Grayson Allen, Dante DiVincenzo. Where will those guys go? Where does Aaron Holiday end up? Some interesting names and players, some foreign kids as well. We'll keep an eye on all that. Reddit AMA at 2 o'clock Eastern today at NBA Reddit to talk about what's going on with this draft. Thanks very much for tuning in. Hope you've enjoyed episode 3 and already listened to episodes 1 and 2. Monday, we'll relaunch with episode 4, and then Tuesday 5, and hopefully a special guest for you on Locked On NBA, giving you more draft coverage on Wednesday. If you want even more draft coverage, Locked On Fantasy Basketball had 2 great interviews, Sam Vicini and Colin Zwicker, and both of those were on June 13th, if you want to go look those up and take a little bit more draft coverage. Great work there by Josh Lloyd on Locked On Fantasy Basketball. Have a great day. This has been Locked On Podcast Mock Draft Picks, episode number 3. For the latest on the rest of the Locked On Podcast Network, go to LockedOnSports.com. Thanks for tuning in to Locked On NBA. We hope you're enjoying the new 5-day-a-week format of Locked On NBA, the place for you to get your quick, digestible look at what's happening in the NBA on a daily basis. Reminder to you that every single one of the NBA teams has a daily Locked On podcast as well. So go find your favorite team and subscribe to their Locked On podcast, available on iTunes, Spotify, and all of your podcatchers. All part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Okay, I've heard you. I will not tell that machine made by Amazon with a female's name to play a Locked On podcast. But you can do it. You can tell to play, program, Locked On, whatever your favorite is. And I promise I won't say, okay, that big, huge mammoth brand that makes all sorts of things, play podcast, such and such anymore. I've heard you. But just let you know, you can do it. You can play all of your Locked On podcast networks on your smart home devices. The Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day, and now just about everywhere.